It is easy to see history as consisting of events far away and unrelated to our day-to-day lives, as events of a bygone era long past. Even when we know on some level that this is not the case, it remains easy for us to underestimate the influence of our history upon our present. This is true especially when one contemplates the significance of large-scale historical events. Many historical events, labeled by commentators as earth-shattering, often, to some degree, change the very structure of how we live our life. Yet, the temptation is strong to see such changes as being purely top-down, as something handed on by a small group of powerful elites. It's easy to underestimate the role that leaders of local communities or even normal everyday people play in such seismic historical events. The Church is, among other things, a communion. Every community of believers and their leaders share a deep union with all other communities and their leaders. This is the result of us being one church, united by a common faith. Important events in church history, especially if they produce large changes, often occur with the participation or input of leaders from throughout the world, and any reforms that follow will often unfold to some extent in different ways or to different degrees in various parts of the church. To understand major events or periods of increased reform or renewal is to study both the history of the church on a global level as well as the interaction of the global with the local. The close relation of the local and the global. This is what it means for the church to be truly Catholic, universal. Certain recent events have given us the opportunity to reflect upon this fact. 2022 marked the 150th anniversary of the founding of the Diocese of Providence. Yet that year also marked the 60th anniversary of the start of the Second Vatican Council. Part of the long and interesting history of this diocese was the many attempts on the part of the local clergy, religious, and laity to properly interpret and implement the teachings of the council. Each bishop present at the council contributed to the council in some way. Not only that, but the manner or extent to which the council was implemented in each diocese was determined in part by the ideological leanings, personal spirituality, and character of the local bishop, and the cultural mindset of the local faithful. In this documentary, we will explore the history of the council, as well as document the experiences of local priests from the Diocese of Providence who lived through the council, and various views of local clergy and scholars on the effects, challenges, and opportunities that arise from the council. Christianity, and Catholicism in specific, has found itself in an interesting dilemma, being a religion based upon immutable principles existing in a world of constant change. Over the course of the modern era, some of these changes manifested themselves in ways that were unfortunately out of step with the general message of the Catholic faith, and which sometimes coupled themselves with anti-Catholic, anti-Christian, or anti-clerical trends. What is more, many Catholics were forced to face certain political and cultural realities that had the potential to bring about massive changes in how the Church expressed her teachings. The Church's attempts to grapple with these issues were not something unique to the period immediately surrounding the Council, but rather traces its roots as far back as almost half a century before the Council.
First of all, you have to realize that the Church in the United States is different from the Church universal. All right, so things happening here are different than what was happening in the world in general. In the world in general, since the First Vatican Council, 1869 to 1870, the world was reacting to the isms of the 17th century. So it was quite defensive. It began by stating papal authority, all right, and fallibility against the isms of the time. And if you want to know what those were, then you have to look at the Syllabus of Errors of Pius IX. All right, since 1869 and to 1970, the church and the world has moved away from colonialism. So it was necessary for the church to separate itself from Western culture if it's going to fulfill the gospel admonition that we preach the gospel to the entire world. The world will accept Christianity, but it doesn't necessarily mean it will accept the culture of the West. All right, so you have a separation there that goes on. The church is since the 1860s, is used to saying no to the isms, right? But it wasn't saying why. And we're still struggling with that. Why is abortion wrong? We haven't still developed our teaching clearly in a way that's going to convince a person who's educated that is still an ongoing process.
I think that the way to read the council, and this comes from Pope Benedict XVI, is to read it within continuity of the history of the church. It's one of 21 ecumenical councils, so I think it's helpful to situate the Second Vatican Council within the theological framework of what was happening in the church around that time. And so I would just point to two things that I think are significant. First, the election of Pope Leo XIII in 1878 initiates a new moment in the modern history of the church, in which for the first time in almost 1,000 years, the Pope does not have land that he's in charge of, the Papal States, but instead is able to focus his attention directly on a theological renewal, and he initiates what's called the Leonine renewal, especially pointing the church towards St. Thomas in philosophy and theology. And that is the kind of theological framework that brings us right up to the Second Vatican Council. And then the second moment is Pope Pius XII, the immediate predecessor of St. John the 23rd, and it's in the years of his pontificate that there's a lot of theological renewal. There's encyclicals on the liturgy, on interpretation of sacred scripture, on ecclesiology, on how to understand the church. There's reform of certain ceremonies, liturgical, especially the Holy Week. So all of that is happening under Pius XII. So there's a desire, I would say, to see the church in her global vision, not just a European vision, but how can the church be a more effective evangelizing instrument to the whole world with a real global vision, and then the various disciplines of theology building upon the Thomistic renewal of Leo XIII, and then especially the theological framework set by Pope Pius XII. The Second Vatican Council should be situated in that kind of theological framework.
Many in the church over the course of the 20th century took the stance that the church's previous method of evangelization was insufficient to actually bring modern society, moving ever farther away from its Christian roots, back in line with the gospel. What the church needed was an approach in which its leadership directly engaged the modern world, finding ways of expressing Catholic teaching that made sense to modern man, given the historical, political, and cultural circumstances that he found himself in. A similar perspective was found in new approaches to the liturgy among Catholic theologians. Starting in the 19th century, a more critical approach to history started to develop among many Christian scholars, including within the Catholic Church. This can be seen with the rise of the historical critical, literary critical, and redactive critical methods of biblical interpretation in the late 18th and 19th centuries. In the late 19th century, after Pope Leo XIII declared the philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas to be the standard of seminary training, there was a renewed interest in both adapting the thought of Aquinas to the contemporary era so as to use it as a tool to fight the errors of modernity, as well as an increased interest among some scholars to better situate the thought of St. Thomas within its immediate intellectual context and broader historical setting. A similar trend could also be found in the general Catholic approach to the Mass and the sacraments, as a result of what would later become known as the liturgical movement. Starting in the 19th century, the liturgical movement began as a movement among European monks who sought to improve the general state of their Eucharistic devotion. The general approach of many was to scour the libraries of their monasteries and analyze old liturgical and theological texts, some of which dated as far back as the medieval period. By examining the history of the liturgy, it was believed we could recapture the general spirit or original intention of the sacraments, and by infusing this into the actual way we practice the sacraments, we could enrich our worship. Among studying these older liturgical documents, many of the monks began to realize that the way the sacraments and the Mass had been celebrated had changed greatly over the years. This thus destroyed the historical misconception, held by many at that time, that the sacramental life of the Church had remained relatively static, that very little, if anything, had changed in the manner of the Church's worship. This, combined with an increased interest in the Bible and early church history, led many Catholic scholars to become fascinated with the history of the sacraments and the Mass. A large number of those associated with the liturgical movement eventually came to the conclusion that some of the practices associated with the Mass were not conducive to bringing about the original intentions of the liturgy. And what is worse, many believed that the basic principles of liturgical theology and the meaning of its prayers and rituals were not being properly communicated to the faithful. A reform in how we practice the act of worship was needed, with a particular goal of reform being to increase the active participation of the laity and better communicate the basic message of liturgical and sacramental theology. With the dawn of the 20th century, the liturgical movement spread beyond its monastic context, as it started to become popular among Catholic intellectual circles throughout Europe and America. In his 1947 encyclical, Mediator Dei, Pope Pius XII gave official papal approval to the basic ideals of the movement, while also nuancing it and counteracting some of its more extreme tendencies from its more liberal supporters.
And one of those concerns is expressed in the liturgical movement that goes back to the 19th century in Europe and then the 1920s and 30s in the United States. Liturgical movement said, in essence, this is simply not the Mass of the priest, and we're spectators, right? And the spectators were encouraged to spend their time meditating on the great mysteries of redemption, and to facilitate that, to use the rosary, which is the common form of lay meditation, if you will. Because they know that is not what the Mass is. It is a communal celebration. It is to prepare us to go out in the world and preach the gospel. So that idea motivates the liturgical reforms and much else.
All of this represented the ideological, cultural, and political context for the council. Nonetheless, the Church in each region of the world was also faced with its own unique set of spiritual, moral, and cultural issues, all of which bore on how each bishop both contributed to and lived out the teachings and reforms of the council. Among American bishops, there were certain issues in specific that were at the forefront of their agenda.
In the United States in the 1950s, we were beginning to see a decline in the number of Catholics attending church. Had reached the peak maybe in 52, 53. A very high percent of the women perhaps 82% of men, maybe 76% Catholic men would attend church. But the numbers were dropping. We knew that, all right? And there was concern why it was. And one of the great things that happened just after the Second World War was we didn't repeat the mistake of the first. We provided for the veterans. It was the greatest investments the United States has ever made in its own people. This is the GI Bill. And the GI Bill enabled many Catholics to go to college. And so you have an educated laity by the 1860s and 70s, which we didn't have before, certainly to the same extent. All right? This educated laity wasn't content to simply say, yes, Bishop. All right? It began to question. So you look at not only the decline in church attendance, but you see a decline in Catholic morality, if you will. You see birth control being more and more accepted by Catholics in the United States. You see abortion more and more accepted by Catholics in the United States, diverting many Catholics away from the teaching magisterium of the church. So you've got mass attendance weakening, all right? The educated laity some would go along and with the idea that it is a communal celebration and prepare for evangelization, and many did not. Not only did we have, as a result of the GI Bill, an educated laity, but we also had an educated laity that was more materially comfortable than we ever had before. So Sundays, you had something as simple as Little League Baseball. Little League Baseball would take people away from going to Mass on Sundays and a host of other activities of Sundays. So rather than expanding the number of people attending Mass, we dropped to the percentage of the Protestants, which is in the 20% area. We haven't gone as far as the Episcopalians, which is down in the 10% area, and less.
Okay.
But again, the world has changed, and we need to speak more clearly, which the Church intended to do in the Vatican Council, to the modern world.
One of those who strongly agreed with the notion that the Church needed to take on a more proactive approach to evangelization was Cardinal Angelo Roncalli, who, upon his papal election in 1958, took on the name of John the 23rd. At the time of his election, Roncalli, age 77, was serving as the Patriarch of Venice and the Cardinal Priest of Santa Prisca, and had previously served as the papal diplomat to France, Greece, Turkey, and Bulgaria. By the time of Pope Pius XII's death, the College of Cardinals was divided between those of a more conservative and those of a more reformist bent. Some commentators at the time defined the Conservative Party as those who placed a strong emphasis on highly centralized church structures and an adherence to more traditional leadership styles. On the other hand, liberals tended to take a more libertarian approach to church hierarchy, believing that local juridical bodies should have greater autonomy, and sought to find what some have called a fresh and bold approach to the care for souls. Cardinal Roncalli, on the other hand, was seen as one of a group of cardinals who were labeled as moderates, as they were believed capable of reconciling the various tendencies known to exist within the Sacred College, as one New York Times reporter noted. Cardinal Roncalli, in specific, was described as broad-minded and conciliatory. Yet, much to the surprise of most, the cardinal everyone thought would be a happy middle ground between the traditionalists and the innovators would, with the opening of the Second Vatican Council, set in motion a series of events that would change the course of Catholic history. John the 23rd had strongly internalized the belief that what the Church needed at this stage in its history was a more proactive approach to evangelization. In the sermon delivered on October 11, 1962, the day the council opened, the good Pope John expressed the following theological sentiments. From the renewed, serene, and tranquil adherence to all the teachings of the Church in their entirety and preciseness, and they still shine forth in the Acts of the Council of Trent and Vatican I, the Christian, Catholic, and apostolic spirit of the whole world expects a step forward. This step should lead toward a doctrinal penetration and formation of consciences in faithful and perfect conformity to the authentic doctrine. This doctrine, however, should be studied and taught through the method of research and the literary forms of modern thought. The substance of the ancient teaching of the Depositum Fidei is one thing. The manner in which it is presented is another. This latter must be taken into great consideration, if necessary, with patience. Everything must be measured in the form and proportion of a magisterium, which is predominantly pastoral in character. The general mindset of Pope John the 23rd was expressed more directly in the following excerpt from the same sermon. What is most important to this ecumenical council is that the sacred deposit of Christian doctrine should be preserved and presented more effectively. But in order for this teaching to reach the multiple fields of human energy, it is first of all necessary that the Church never turn its attention away from the sacred deposit of truth received from its fathers. But at the same time, it is also necessary that it also look at the times which have introduced new conditions of life, new ways of living, and open new paths for the Catholic apostolate.
That is always a tension that's going to exist at any moment in the history of the Church, where there's, of course, a need to conserve or preserve the deposit of faith, and there is also a desire to share it and put it in terms that are going to be the most attractive for people. And so that's going to be a tension in the whole history of the Church. The beginning at the very first day, I think, of the council, the famous speech of John the 23rd, Pope John the 23rd, when he distinguishes between the truths of faith and the deposit of faith and how they're passed on, preserving the same sense and the same meaning. So that is going to be a tension. I would say, however, I think we should, avoid too much interpretation as if they're, as if the principal concern is a debate or something, where it's in fact, there's a desire of the Church, desire of the popes to make the truths of faith as attractive as they can be in the modern world. And what is the Catholic interpretation of the council? It's to receive it, to receive the authentic teaching of the Church docilely and obediently. And of course, there are going to be debates about how this was implemented or how could this be implemented in a more effective way. But in terms of the ultimate posture a Catholic should have toward any of the 21 ecumenical councils of the Church is a receptivity for what the truths of faith are being communicated to us.
Retaining the substance of Church teaching, but adapting the forms of expression to the cultural and political circumstances of the times. Bringing the gospel in a renewed manner to the different facets of everyday life. Certainly these were noble ends, but also ones that were vast and far-reaching in terms of its impact on how the Church was to carry out its mission. The start of the Council thus represented a seismic shift in the general direction of how the Church envisioned or carried out the more pastoral elements of its mission. Yet, at the time of the Council, how much emphasis was placed on these changes, or how it was presented to the priests and seminarians of that time, varied greatly depending on their proximity to the Council. This can be seen when one speaks with priests of the Diocese of Providence who lived through the changes of the Council. We see this in the example of one local senior priest, Father Robert Byrne. Father Byrne was ordained a priest in 1963, a year after the Council started, after studying at Our Lady of Providence Seminary and St. Mary's Seminary in Baltimore. After spending a brief period working at the Cathedral of Saints Peter and Paul, he was assigned to serve as the pastor of St. Lucy's Parish in Middletown, where he spent most of the 1960s and 1970s. In 1977, he began a new phase of his ministry, being stationed in South America to work side by side with the Mary Knoll Society, an organization of priests and religious dedicated to missionary activity. Father Byrne recalls his experiences with the council in the following manner.
I was ordained in 1963 after seminary both in Wagoneck and down in Baltimore.
Oh, and where did you study down in Baltimore?
I was only there for 3 years and doing theology.
And so you finished your seminary training right as the council was beginning. And so what was the biggest change in your seminary training between the time you started the council and then?
None. No change.
So you didn't really notice that much of a.
Well, personally, I knew what was happening in Europe, and so I was very serious about trying to keep in touch with what was developing by reading periodicals in the seminary library, coming out of Europe, talking about this coming council, and that was kind of my plug into the changes that might be coming. We didn't have any idea what they might be.
And so how was the council, well, first of all, did they talk about the council a lot when you were in seminary?
No, they didn't, no. It was a meeting going on in Rome, but no, it wasn't talked about very much.
Other priests connected with the diocese had a radically different experience with the council as it was occurring. Such was the case with Father Joseph Creedon. Ordained a priest in 1968, Father Creedon spent most of his early ministry as a religion teacher at La Salle Academy and later a chaplain at the University of Rhode Island, while serving at a series of different parishes throughout the diocese. In the early 1980s, he was assigned as the pastor of Christ the King Parish in Kingston, a position that he served until his retirement in 2012. Father Creedon spent part of his priestly formation at the American College at Louvain, one of the major intellectual centers of Catholicism in Europe, and was even privileged to attend the opening Mass for the final session of the Second Vatican Council in 1965. Many of the professors associated with Louvain went on to serve as periti, Latin for experts, that is, theological advisors to the Pope and the bishops during the council. Unlike priests and seminarians outside Europe, who often had varying degrees of exposure to the council while it was unfolding, Father Creedon, like others studying in Europe during the time of the council, found themselves caught in the immediate shadow of that which would set the stage for major changes in church practice and theological self-expression.
I was ordained in 1968 in Louvain, Belgium. I did my high school and college seminary at Our Lady of Providence in Wagoneck at that time, down by Rocky Point. And then was sent over to Louvain for my training, and as luck would have it, the council ran from 62 to 65, I believe. So I was in Louvain September 64, and we were given special permission. The first summer you were supposed to spend the entire summer in France learning the language because your classes were in French. But because of the historic nature of the council, we were allowed to go down to Rome to see the opening of the final session of the council, which was a fabulous experience. And then for classes, because Cardinal Sunens from Malines, Brussels Archdiocese, who was a very big presence at the council for the progressives at the council, and the University of Louvain was in his diocese, and it's a diocesan university. And so he took some of the theology professors to Rome with him as his periti, as his experts. So some of them were missing from class for a while, but they were right in the midst of the whole thing, and they'd come back and you could just see the excitement, in the way they, even the canon law professor, he's saying they're doing this and it's changing canon law, And so it was just a time of tremendous energy in the church. And I think to understand that, you have to appreciate what the church was like before the council. When John the 23rd, I think it was a mass at Mary Major, it may have been at John Lateran, but he announced that he was going to call a council. And there were 8 or 9 cardinals there, and there was dead silence. They didn't think there was a need for a council. And they basically said to him, "You're so old." And that's why it's going to get started. And they said, no, it takes much longer to organize. He says, no, we're going to start. And it was, the famous line that he had, it's time to open up the windows and let some fresh air into the church. And that's basically what he was trying to do. And just as Pope Francis today is meeting some resistance because of his openness to change, John the 23rd met a lot of opposition to what he was trying to do. But it was a fascinating time in the church, fascinating.
Others studied even closer to the heart of things. One example is Father Jack Lavin, ordained a priest in 1964. Father Lavin spent the early part of his ministry working with the marriage tribunal and would go on to work with various parishes throughout the diocese. He's the former pastor of St. Raymond's Parish in Warwick and St. Joseph's Parish in Newport. Father Lavin initially studied at the American College at Louvain, and after his ordination was sent back to Europe to study at the Pontifical Lateran University. During the course of his studies, Father Lavin was privileged to witness part of 2 of the sessions of the council. In many ways, Father Lavin's experiences parallel those of Father Creedon. Yet, Father Lavin also noted a certain level of diversity in interpreting and implementing the council, even within the European Church.
Well, I grew up here in Cranston, went to LaSalle, went to public schools here in Cranston, went to LaSalle, and I went to Our Lady of Providence, and after I graduated from LaSalle, graduated from Our Lady of Providence in Warwick Neck, I went to the American College in Louvain. I was there for 4 years, and I was ordained in June 27, 1964. Subsequent to that, I was assigned almost immediately to go to Rome, and I spent 3 years in Rome studying canon law. I was there from 64 to 67 and completed my doctorate in canon law and returned to the States. Well, again, my formation was from Belgium and the Dutch church too, and I found it very liberal in opening my mind to seeing the world in a different way, getting away from the legalism. Well, in Louvain, many of the Paridi experts, theological experts, came from Louvain and were at the council, so we were greatly influenced by what we learned in Louvain. The time in Louvain was very, very pivotal in my life. Apart from my family, the most important influence in my life has been my 4 years in Louvain.
And so, what was the general sentiment or attitude towards the council among the people at Louvain?
Oh, very favorable. Very, very favorable. We knew that there was a new church on the horizon. So it was a very exciting time.
And so, obviously, your time at the Lateran University sort of partly overlapped with the council and its immediate aftermath.
I was present in Rome for 2 sessions of the council.
And so, what was the general attitude of the professors and your fellow students at the Lateran University, and how did it differ from the attitude, did it differ at all from the at Louvain?
Perhaps not as positive as Louvain, but it was in a state of flux too. The Lateran was in a state of flux, and so many new things were happening, so they were just catching up with it. The Lateran was a very traditional university. It's called the Roman University. And when I was at the Casa, which is a resident house, the Casa, we went to a variety of schools, the Angelicum, the Greg, the Lateran, some were studying scripture, some were studying canon law, theology, philosophy, so we had a variety of interest. Well, I was there for 2 sessions. I didn't attend all the sessions. I did get on the floor of the council, and I saw how it operated. It was just a very exciting time to be in Rome. And we met all kinds of bishops and theologians and experts.
The debates at the council were lively. The council fathers were, as a whole, devoted to the mission of the council, but there was strong disagreement concerning its implementation. The council believed that the church needed a more pastoral approach to dealing with the modern world, but what was meant by this was the cause of much debate. More conservative members of the College of Bishops interpreted the notion of being pastoral in rather traditional terms. Pastoral, for them, referred to the duty of priests and religious to preach the truths of the faith in as exact a manner as possible, usually as expressed in the precise and well-defined categories of scholastic thought. Being pastoral was interpreted in a defensive manner. The church in modernity was acting within the context of highly secularized societies, governments that were often antagonistic to the interests of the church, and an intelligentsia and cultural elite steeped in heretical, philosophical, and theological systems. Those bishops of a more progressive bent, like those of a more conservative bent, acknowledged that modern society was moving further and further away from its Christian roots, and that what was needed was for the church to proclaim the gospel anew, so as to draw the culture back to the Christian message. Nonetheless, progressives at the council had a much different vision of what was meant by having a pastoral approach. For them, being pastoral referred not so much to a concern for the content of the faith, but with how it was expressed. While the content of the faith was immutable and therefore remained the same from one historical period to the next, the church needed to find ways of expressing the universal and perpetual message of the Christian faith in ways that would resonate with or make sense to people living in a specific historical period. The church needed to analyze the signs of the times and be in touch with current ideological shifts and changes in self-expression, and adapt the teaching style of the church to these new conditions. It was a method of pastoral leadership and evangelization rooted in dialogue. It was a method that, while avoiding the pitfall of indifferentism and rooted in a desire to present the faith with as much clarity as possible, also acknowledged or understood the opinions of its interlocutors and was attentive to the manner in which it expressed its beliefs so as to convey the message of the Christian faith in a way that would appeal the most to those with whom one was speaking. Some bishops and theologians present at the council also believed that the more progressive approach also necessarily entailed a more ecumenical dynamic to it, and thus believed that the goals or agenda of the council necessarily also entailed a commitment to interreligious dialogue. The writing, revising, and discussing of the documents produced by the council represented a playing out of the debates between these two visions of how the church should interact with the world. Many of those present initially believed that the conclusions of the council were already set in stone, and that it was simply a matter of rubber stamping pre-made documents. Nonetheless, Pope John XXIII was concerned with creating as open an environment as possible for discussing the topics in question. This can be seen even in the immediate lead-up to the council. For example, in 1959, while preparing for the council, Pope John desired the input of all his top theological advisors, and thus asked representatives of each of the sacred congregations of the Roman Curia to be members of the Ante-Preparatory Committee. The openness to dialogue in the council can also be seen in the actions of Cardinal Domenico Tardini, the Vatican Secretary of State and Archpriest of St. Peter's Basilica, who was tasked with organizing the preparation for the council. While doing so, he sent out letters to all the Catholic prelates scattered throughout the world asking for their theological input. He initially toyed with the possibility of creating a questionnaire of topics, asking the bishops to decide which ones, if any, they would like to discuss during the council, but rejected even that idea, believing it to be too limiting. During the council itself, various committees were formed to discuss the drafts of the council documents before they were brought to the council body as a whole for discussion. churchmen of various ideological persuasions would form alliances with one another in order to advance their ideological goals. Yet, while certain ideological overtones from certain schools of thought in the church tended to be more influential than others in the drafts, debate was still lively in the period between the completion of the document drafts and their final approval by the Pope and Council. In spite of the intense debates taking place over the course of the Council, the bishops were fundamentally united in their understanding of the Council as a necessary event to help the Church better engage the modern world. While every bishop contributed to the council, every bishop had their own set of theological and pastoral concerns and ideological leanings. Thus, how each bishop contributed to the council differed greatly from bishop to bishop. What is more, the pace, manner, or extent to which the reforms of the church were implemented also differed from diocese to diocese, depending on the theological mindset of the bishop and the cultural and religious disposition of the local faithful. The one who set the mold concerning the general attitude of most bishops in the Diocese of Providence with regard to Vatican II was the reigning bishop of this diocese at the time of the council, Bishop Russell McVinney. Born in 1898 in Warren, Rhode Island, McVinney was a graduate of LaSalle Academy. Spending part of his theological formation at the University of Louvain, Bishop McVinney was ordained a priest in 1924 at the age of 26. Serving as the pastor of St. Patrick's Parish in Providence and later St. Edward's Parish in Pawtucket, he later served as a religion teacher at St. Raphael's Academy. In 1941, at the age of 43, he was appointed to be the rector of Our Lady of Providence Seminary. In 1948, at the age of 50, he was consecrated bishop at the Cathedral of Saints Peter and Paul, the mother church of the Diocese of Providence, by Archbishop Amleto Ciccognani, an Italian churchman and titular Archbishop of Laodicea in Phrygia. Serving as the Bishop of Providence for 23 years until his death in 1971, thereby making him the third longest reigning bishop in the diocese, Bishop McVinney was the one who would shepherd the diocese during and in the immediate aftermath of the council. Records of Vatican II show that quotes from Bishop McVinney during the council are scant, but what few statements he did put forward put him squarely in the camp of the more conservative party.
He said very little.
Yeah.
He didn't say much. We would get together with him occasionally. He was a very shy man. Yeah, he wasn't always easy to talk to. But he was always very gracious. He was always very kind to me. So, but he didn't say much about the council. Like, he didn't agree with a lot of it.
For example, a former bishop of the Diocese of Providence, Russell J. McVinney, who was not a big fan of the council, to put it mildly. And when he was leaving to go to the council, he was interviewed, and he said, "You don't break up a winning ball team, okay? Why are you going to mess with this? It's working." But very soon it was not going to be working, and he couldn't quite see that. And a number of people couldn't quite see that.
One example of this trend was a quote of Bishop McVinney that he said during a meeting of the council held on November 12, 1962, during a debate surrounding Sacrosanctum Concilium, the council's document on the sacred liturgy. The draft of Sacrosanctum Concilium was the first topic discussed by the council. Many commentators at that time believed that what was said in the draft was not radical enough to cause any major divisions within the church. Nonetheless, it still, in a very clear manner, gave expression to certain goals of the more reformist party within the church. Pope John the 23rd, for example, when speaking to the committee that prepared the draft in June of 1961 during the preparation of the council, stated that renewal of the Church's doctrine and practice surrounding the liturgy would bring about a renewed sense of holiness on the part of the clergy, better communicate the basic tenets of the faith to the people, and motivate the laity, especially the youth, to take part in greater advances for social activism. This, as some later historians noted, was in line with many of the teachings of the liturgical movement. There were many well-known American clergymen and scholars involved in the preparatory committee that produced the draft of Sacro Sanctum Concilium, including Father Johannes Quasten, a professor of patristics at the Catholic University of America. Father Quasten's colleague at the Catholic University of America, Father Frederick McManus, an expert in canon law, and Father Godfrey Diekman, a Benedictine monk at St. John's Abbey in Minnesota. All council documents were prepared by a committee before being brought to the floor to be debated by the bishops. One section of the draft suggested that the Church's ascetical norms, including its rules on fasting, be adapted to the spiritual needs and cultural norms of the Church in each part of the world. Bishop McVinney feared that the wording of this section would be used to justify an unnecessary watering down of the Church's spiritual and ascetical practices by those addicted to pleasure or comfort, which in turn would have adverse effects on the Church and the larger society. Bishop McVinney said to those present, "It seems to me, therefore, imperative that we impress upon our people the need for penance and reparation for personal sins and the sins of society." He continued by asserting what he believed to be a morally problematic yet widespread trend in society and the Church at that time, saying, "I feel it most important in our day when the conviction of the need of penance is being disregarded." Bishop McVinney went on to cite what he described as the ever-widening tendency towards softness of life, which leads many among the faithful to constantly ask for the relaxation of disciplines made sacred by the strict observance of our more sturdy forebears. Bishop McVinney concluded his speech before the council by affirming that modern society needs to look to the example of saints such as Francis of Assisi, who was renowned for a high level of holiness resulting from a life of strict ascesis, ending his statements by saying, "This era needs to be made conscious of the fact that heaven belongs to the strong." In the aftermath of the council, McVinney's more conservative commitments still remained evident. In 1970, during a meeting of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, the American hierarchy debated whether or not to allow communion in the hand. Bishop McVinney was ardent in his opposition to the practice, believing that it degraded the nature of the sacrament, as well as the dignity of the faithful, and opened up the possibility of abuse. Nonetheless, Bishop McVinney's leadership style was more nuanced than simply a criticism of reformist movements in the Church. Bishop McVinney's personal conservatism was often coupled with a more moderate stance in his public theological pronouncements and a strong emphasis on obedience to the Church.
The bishop of the time was Russell J. McVinney. Bishop McVinney is very conservative, very traditional, but he is a totally committed and totally devoted churchman. If the Church tells him to do something, he'll do it. He allowed the vernacular to be used in church liturgies, but he himself continued to say Mass in Latin. Right? That was his. He would mandate that the changes, particularly in the liturgy, take place, but he wanted to do so in an orderly way. And so he set up a liturgical commission on which he placed people that he trusted to oversee and to direct, if you will, through education, liturgical in the implementation of the liturgical changes. So he allowed the changes to be implemented. We had some very interesting liturgical experiments that were later roundly condemned, and we had a division.
As with most major historical events, it is sometimes easy to underestimate the full impact of the council when one is living through it. Many average Catholics were steeped in the belief that every part of church teaching and practice, whether in its form or substance, was immutable and unchangeable. Not only was the council thus something unexpected, but many Catholics were not aware of the day-to-day deliberations taking place during the council. It was thus difficult to anticipate the full impact of the reforms brought about by the council. This was particularly true in the American church. Whereas European Catholics were living in the immediate shadow of the council and the events leading up to it, Catholics living outside of Europe due to their distance were not as influenced by the major shifts that led to the council. Thus, while there were many American Catholic clergymen and theologians, including those in the more reformist camp, who were highly influential at the council, the average American Catholic tended to be defined by a more conservative theological attitude.
I think it's all explained experientially. I'm not sure the average Christian was aware that the tectonic plates of theology were shifting. It was a very odd time. In my class in Louvain, I was considered one of the more conservative members. I came home and they thought I was a bull goose loony liberal. Now I hadn't changed, just the environment had changed. The church in the United States was not as open to embracing the council as some other churches, like especially in Europe, were.
Well, theologically, the European church was much more advanced than the American church. And the American church at that time was by the book. This is what the rules are, follow the rules. And this is who the bishop is, this is who's the pastor. It was a very hierarchical church. My first pastor, I won't give his name, it was not a happy situation. And he fought the council, fought the changes in the church. He went along with it because he had to, but it wasn't a personal commitment. And there were a number of pastors like that fought the changes. They went along with them because they had to, but they didn't really live by them or accept them.
What about the average everyday layperson?
They went along with it. They adjusted. There were some tensions. Sign of the peace. There were people who refused to give the sign of peace. You stick out your hand and want to wish somebody peace, and they just turn away from you. And that was painful. That was very painful to see. But there was someone who was very enthusiastic about it too, accepted the changes and saw them as great value.
So what was the biggest difference in terms of how the teachings or reforms of the council were either received or implemented in America as opposed to in Europe?
It depended. The East Coast is radically different from the West Coast, both culturally and politically, and also in terms of the church. And the Midwest too. The Midwest and the West Coast accepted it much more quickly, much more readily than we did here on the East Coast. And you won't believe the fight that took place about communion in the hands. Oh, that was a big fight. That was Cardinal Carberry fought it. A lot of money was expended fighting the communion in the hands.
Really?
Yep. And look today, it's accepted. It's a given. I was in Louvain, and when I was in Europe, and particularly in France and parts of Belgium and Holland and Germany, they were going through a lot of these changes already. There was a lot of progression taking place in the church, liturgically, that we hadn't experienced at all in this country.
But that was even during and before the council?
Yes.
Some scholars and clergy have argued that the biggest cause of change in the attitude of the average Catholic came about not so much through explicit changes in beliefs or attitudes, but by the new ways the Catholic faith was implemented in the execution of the teachings of the council to bring about concrete reforms.
I think for most people where they came to experience the council was in the liturgy. For example, the old Requiem Mass, the old funeral Mass, was black vestments. And they sang, Dies Irae, Dies Illa, Day of Wrath, Day of... I mean, it was a very negative experience. And now all of a sudden you can wear white vestments, and it's the Mass of Christian burial, and you could sing Alleluias, not because death doesn't hurt, but because we believe that death isn't the end. And so you celebrate this as entrance into everlasting life. It's the same reality. It's just your expectations have changed. And I think that connected with people. I think people, one classic example is the eating of meat on Friday, okay? The not being allowed to eat meat on Friday. You could go out to dinner and have lobster thermidor, and that was considered a form of penance. Okay, well, if that's penance, then I'm a saint.
There, as always is the case in the history of the Church, that you have conciliar documents and decrees, but then it's for popes and bishops to implement them, to ensure that what the council calls for actually is happening in the various dioceses throughout the world. And in some respects, you could look at the decades following the Second Vatican Council and the documents of the Holy See, of the various popes that followed the council and the various dicasteries, as this provides the authentic interpretation, the authentic implementation of the council. And so I would say, insofar as there is a divide, I mean, the fundamental divide would be between those who recognize in the documents of the council and in the authentic interpretation by the popes and the congregations of the Holy See after, to recognize in that the actual true, as it were, Vatican II, the true council is right in the documents. It is true, I think it's fair to say, that there were some who want to de-emphasize the documents and say that there is a reality that is broader than the documents themselves, and that of course can be dangerous, especially if it's set against the documents of the council. Ultimately, what we want to find is a hermeneutic of continuity and avoid discontinuity and rupture. So ultimately a division, and it's not left or right, it's those who see in the council its place within the councils of the church, and those who, for whatever reason, one way or another, want to emphasize that, or to suggest that the council suggests some kind of radical rupture with the past, either that they are very happy about that rupture or very unhappy about that rupture. In my view, the error is to emphasize the rupture as opposed to looking at it through the lens of the hermeneutic of continuity and reform. Sure, so when we talk about the Second Vatican Council, ultimately we're talking about the 16 documents of the Council, and then the question is how each of those are implemented. I would say there are two big moments. One is the new Code of Canon Law. So that was an enormous project that it's not until 1983 that Pope John Paul II promulgates the new Code of Canon Law to integrate the teaching of the Second Vatican Council in terms of ecclesiology, in terms of the life of the Church, in terms of what the Council said about priesthood and religious life and lay faithful, and many other topics. So it's the Code of Canon Law is a very important moment, and then the new Catechism, 1992 Catechism of the Catholic Church, the Vatican II Catechism, in a way corresponding to the Catechism of the Council of Trent, which came after the 16th century Reforming Council of Trent. So those are two very important moments. And then, as you point out, the liturgical reforms, some of which had preceded the Second Vatican Council under Pius XII, some of which you'd say even before that. Pius X is a very important figure in the reform of the liturgy, especially sacred music, the breviary. But yeah, it's after The first document, as you know, the Second Vatican Council, Sacrosanctum Concilium, is about the sacred liturgy, and then in the years immediately following the council, you have reformed rites of not only the Mass, but of the Liturgy of the Hours, of the other sacraments, and other liturgical practices of the Church. And then, of course, it doesn't just stop there. I mean, as we know, in the English-speaking world, it's about 10 years ago, there was a new Roman missal that was issued, translating a bit more accurately the third edition of the Roman Missal promulgated by Pope John Paul II in the year 2000. So there's been many steps in that liturgical reform, but I wouldn't want to reduce or narrow the vision of the Council to merely the sacred liturgy. There's a whole lot of areas in which the Council had important things to say, and in a way each of those areas had to be implemented in the various pontificates that followed from Paul VI onto our present day.
A spiritual renewal, as expressed in the reform of the Church's liturgy and canon law, as well as the development of new ways of expressing the perennial truths of the faith, had a large impact on how Vatican II was received and implemented. Yet, other, more specifically cultural factors also played a role.
In terms of the Church in the United States, I mean, I think in many respects the Council was well received, precisely because the bishops made such a significant contribution. In a way, it's the first ecumenical council in which there's a very strong American presence and a certain powerful, if you want, American presence, especially regarding the document on religious liberty, Dignitatis Humanae, but also other texts as well. So there's a way in which the Church in the United States, the theologians and the bishops made a particularly strong contribution to the Council. I think it has to be said that in the years that succeeding the Council, I don't think it is fair to say because of it, but the Church has experienced a number of challenges. There's been a number of difficulties, institutional, a decline in sacramental practice, and so it's not as though there haven't been significant challenges that have faced the Church in that period. That's why I think it's helpful to look at the documents of the Council and to find in them, especially in their interpretation by the popes who have succeeded the Council, an especially rich and authentic expression of Catholic faith.
Vatican II and the events in its immediate aftermath represented the first time in the 2,000-year history of the Church in which the American hierarchy contributed in a significant way to the decrees and theological conclusions of an ecumenical council. And in the aftermath of the council, some of the best-known commentators on the council, those who, in various ways, to various degrees, have set the mold for how the council is to be implemented, have been American clergy and theologians. Unfortunately, attempts to bring about the longed-for renewal in the Church weren't without challenges. The Church, in the aftermath of the council, was defined by conflicting views on what reform looked like. Some argued that the state of the culture should be the guiding principle, laying the basis for the interpretation and implementation of Church teaching and the conciliar reforms. Others believed that reform of Church teaching and practice and new ways of presenting the faith were necessary, but the reforms should be firmly rooted in Church teaching. That is, the traditional magisterium of the Church, and a reading of the decisions of the Council in their original context and in light of tradition should influence how we respond to the culture. In practice, these two views led to very different points of emphasis. The mindset that defined the more liberal proponents of the Council was born out of the belief that making the teachings of the Church more appealing to modern man was a sign of progress within the Church, whereas the more moderate or conservative proponents of the Council believed that finding new ways of expressing the faith was a way of drawing modern man into the immutable and eternal truths of the faith. Thus, liberals tended to have a much broader understanding of the nature or extent of reform and tended to emphasize the role of the Church in social uplift and political progress. Conservatives in the church tended to believe that reform should not surpass that which was officially called for or approved by the church in its traditional teachings, and that new ways of expressing church teaching and practice should build on or reflect what was taught in previous generations, something accompanied by the strong emphasis on a strict adherence to traditional church teaching and practice. Others went as far as to claim that the shift in emphasis and the reforms called for by the council were irreconcilable with the traditional, that is, pre-conciliar, teachings and practices of the church. A microcosm of this was found in the Diocese of Providence. In the 1950s, Bishop McVinney founded the Brothers of Our Lady of Providence, a religious order dedicated to assisting the bishop with various ministries around the diocese. In the aftermath of the council, the order became subject to internal divisions concerning the goals of the order, something rooted in different interpretations of the council. These internal divisions led Bishop McVinney to place restrictions on the order until they could resolve these internal divisions, including not allowing any novices or people not already in the order from taking solemn vows. This led to a rapid decline in the number of members of this order, as many members died or left the order. Father Dennis Keaton, a priest in residence at St. John and Paul Parish in Coventry, spent most of his early ministry with the Brothers of Our Lady of Providence.
Well, I was in high school when Vatican II was convened under Pope John the 23rd. So I was really kind of oblivious to what was going on. It was a public school, so it wasn't a major discussion. And so in my senior year, I was the center of the team. We were playing for a very important game. And the counselor called me in, the school counselor. And he started talking about joining the army and all the wonderful things about, you can do all this crap.
Yeah.
And then you end up carrying a gun, getting shot at. But at that time, I was looking at my watch and I was getting late for football practice, and the coach did not like that. So I told him, I was trying to think real quick how to get out of there. So I said, I'm thinking about being a priest. So, public school, what do they got to do with it? So he says, okay. So off I went, and I went to the field. And then the Friday before the big game on Saturday, he calls me in his office again. What? He says, I got a letter here from a brother, Martin Lapkowski, who wants to interview anybody that's interested in religious life. I said, oh, jeez. I mean, this can't be true. So just to get out of there, because I'm late again, I said, sure, I'll meet him, and I took off. Next thing you know, I get a phone call from home, and it's Brother Martin Lapkowski. And he says, would you like to spend the weekend with us? We'd like to invite you for the weekend. I said, I changed my mind, blah, blah. He says, you're not getting chicken feed, are you? You're not backing out. The male ego just couldn't handle it. Yeah, all right, I'll be there. And I went for the weekend, and I ended up staying. And now I graduated in '85, and now the council's coming to a close, and a lot of the constitutions are being implemented and stuff. So when I first entered the Brothers of Our Lady of Providence, we were semi-monastic. We wore the habit, the scapula, the cowl. Novitiate was very strict. We only talked twice a day. But then all of a sudden, with all these new changes coming in, kind of like a division happened in the brothers a little bit. Some wanted to become more monastic, and others wanted to become more involved with social issues, as the Vatican was calling us to, reach out. To make a long story short, I spent 5 years in the Brotherhood and never took a vow because Bishop McVinney at the time refused to take any more vows until the order settled down, because we were leaving like droves. I think there was about 9 or 10 professed brothers. There was 11 of us in the novitiate, and some more waiting to come in when we had room, and all of a sudden it just fell apart. They started in 1950, I believe. I could be wrong, but I believe they started in 1950. under bishop, because at the Vatican Council, maybe, yeah, 65, 60. But anyway, after the Vatican Council, bishops could start their own orders for the needs of their diocese, but they had to be under an established rule, like a Benedictine or Capuchin or whatever. We happened to be under Capuchin, and that was a bishop. Then he refused to take any more vows. It was sort of like a crack, not a big, but it was a crack. There was that the people in the bishop had very little to say about it because we weren't informed too much of what was going on.
The level of debate and division in the Church that followed the Council is nothing new. The faithful and clergy have been struggling in every era to delve into deeper, clearer visions of the meaning and application of the truths of divine revelation and the teachings of the Church's magisterium. The Church is continually attempting to live out the Council, to implement its teachings and reforms with ever greater degrees of faithfulness to the original intentions of the Council and the apostolic tradition of the Church more generally. This leads to a larger question. What is the biggest lesson that Catholics living today can learn from the Second Vatican Council? The Second Vatican Council is the most recent ecumenical council of the Church, and the issues it was responding to are still ongoing, and to a degree have only become more complex since the Council. For many, the ever-changing nature of the situation in the Church and society, with its ever-increasing levels of complexity, showcases the need to more effectively communicate the truths of the faith to the people. This is an aspect of the Council's teachings, which serves as its most important and relevant element.
I think the biggest challenge is that we continue to fulfill the admission of Christ, which is to preach the gospel to the world. I think we could do a better job of teaching. Right now, one of the main elements of teaching has been the Sunday sermon. I think Sunday sermons are much better, especially those that focus on the Gospels. In the teaching of the gospel, teaching of the Christian way of life. We're dependent upon a Catholic school system. That has pretty well fallen by the wayside because of financial and lack of personnel that were willing to give their life to teaching at low pay, or no pay. I think our catechetical programs that we have in our parish are struggling. So we have a situation where I experienced in teaching with kids coming into college, they really did not know the Catholic faith and tradition. They did not know the scriptures. So I think our visit is a challenge, has always been, and as it was in the beginning of teaching, proclaiming the good news.
Yeah, I mean, the challenge of the Church in every age, in a certain way, is the same. It's our own sinfulness or timidity about preaching the faith and about living the faith. So sin of whatever kind is presents a challenge, an obstacle to sharing the faith. I think that the gift of the Second Vatican Council is to help the Church rediscover her apostolic fervor, her evangelical fervor, and in a certain way to give the Church the posture for how to approach the challenges of the contemporary world. That is, it's radically, deeply convinced in the faith. It's putting out into the deep Christ. And at the same time, radically open to whatever is good and true and beautiful. We want to affirm that. We don't want to be seen as the church of no, but the church of yes to Jesus and the freedom that he offers. And so I think that the documents of the Second Vatican Council offer the church a paradigm or platform to be convinced Christians, radically open to the world, not entrenched, aware of the challenges that face us, but confidently Catholic, confident and bold in the proclamation of the faith. And I think the Council, the documents of the Council, especially in their authentic interpretation, offer the Church that kind of a posture.
This renewed emphasis on teaching also includes a strong emphasis on the social element of the Church's mission.
What we do in the realms of social work is part of that teaching. All right, that's one of the things that Bishop McVinney excelled at, I think, his support of the social mission of the Church. But that's living out which we preach, and we need to do both. But I think preaching and teaching are the biggest challenges we're faced right now.
Finding better ways to communicate the faith more generally goes hand in hand with the need to better understand the broader framework put forward by Vatican II to address the issues of the modern age.
Well, the biggest challenge, of course, will always be to translate the theological content of the Council into a language that the people understand. Because theology is a science. Theology has its own vocabulary. You say to someone, I want to explain to you the hypostatic union. Well, you can hear minds closing all over the room. Now, the hypostatic union is how was Jesus human and divine at the same time? Now, you can have a conversation about that. I always say the early church had trouble believing Jesus was divine. The church in our time has trouble believing Jesus was human, just because of where we're coming from. I mean, if you walked with this guy and you saw him sleep and you heard him snore, it's pretty hard to think he's God. But at post-resurrection people, you say, well, he's God, but was he human? And so that dynamic, you just have to try and explain that. The whole notion of ecclesiology. The first decree of the Second Vatican Council was on the liturgy, which was a really important statement, because as the document says, liturgy is the summit towards which all our efforts are geared and the fountain from which all of our energy flows. So these people who say that, the Second Vatican Council destroyed liturgy, no, they didn't. They set it free to do what it's supposed to do. Now, it takes a while to get that going. But then the next one was De Ecclesia, according to the Church. And just the way the chapters are organized. They didn't start off with the Church as a hierarchical institution. They said the Church is the people of God. I mean, that's a massive change. Because I was, Church is a hierarchical institution founded by Jesus Christ to provide salvation for all people. That means the Pope speaks to the Cardinal speaks to the Bishop speaks to the priest speaks to the nuns speak to the brothers, and then everybody tells the lay people what to do. That's a hierarchical structure. And no, it's not. It's the people of God. It's not a pyramid, it's a circle. Now, it takes a while for that to catch on. We still haven't caught on. But like Pope Francis now with synodality. That's just talking about the circle. It's talking about the people of God. Everybody's opinion counts. But that's hard to, And a lot of people in the pyramid, especially those in positions of authority, don't want to give up the authority. It's not rocket science. It's human nature.
One of the core elements of Vatican II's spiritual and theological framework, that which should most powerfully motivate us to spread the gospel, is the recognition that the church is born out of an intimate relationship with God and is ordered toward the goal of bringing others into deeper relationship with God.
What do you think is the biggest challenge? And what do you think is the biggest opportunity that was given to us by the council?
To really believe that we are the people of God, to really believe that we really need each other, that we don't go it alone, that whole sense of community. What I miss about not being a pastor is I don't miss the administration, do not miss it at all, but I miss the daily contact with staff and people. I miss that. That was a real important part of my life. I don't know, we've in many respects lost the sense of the sacred. The political scene frightens me. The future of the United States frightens me right now. And I think that's probably because we've lost the sense of the sacred. The divisions that are taking place, I just find that frightening. The hatred that's taking place and the name calling, I find that frightening. So.
The church has a mission to call the world back to the sacred, to enter into deeper relation with its divine creator and redeemer. And only when holding to values rooted in this relationship can society see not only material, but also moral and spiritual progress, even in the midst of an ever-changing, ever more complex series of social, political, and economic contexts. And this serves as the core message of the Second Vatican Council. The church is not of the world, but it finds itself in the world, and as a result is obliged to discern new opportunities in the current cultural context to draw people into closer union with itself, and ultimately with Christ. As the council document Lumen Gentium writes, Christ is the light of nations. Because this is so, the sacred synod, gathered together in the Holy Spirit, eagerly desires, by proclaiming the gospel to every creature, to bring the light of Christ to all men, a light brightly visible on the countenance of the church.